Hello and welcome back to the Determinants of Health. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the value of social networks in sustaining and promoting good health. Now, social networks are more than just hanging out with your friends. There's deep social theory involved in how various institutions and groups of individuals interact and the kinds of assistance that members of your community can offer you, and indeed how they can actually make you worse as well. So let's get started. What is a social support network? It's a variety of things. It includes your friends, members of your community. That could be your school community, your work community, or your neighborhood. It could be your life partner, your husband, your wife, your girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever. The person who lives next to you. It can even be institutions in your life. Your school, your medical provider, the daycare you send your children to. Anywhere that offers services that are supportive emotionally and informationally. Why do we care about this? Care because there is very strong evidence that the extent to which an individual receives social support from his or her network actually leads to measurable good health. Now, the obvious example is in mental illness. People with bad mental health outcomes tend to be people with poor social support situations. But of course, you have to ask yourself, is it a chicken or egg ordeal? What I mean by that is, do you have a poor social network because you're mentally ill, or are you mentally ill because you have a poor social support network? The answer isn't simple. It's probably a bit of both. But we do know that people who are clinically depressed have lower levels of social support in their lives, typically. But again, this is not just about mental illness. What we see is that social support and social networks have a role to play in all kinds of health issues. For example, this 1979 study found that people who were less socially integrated, those who had less robust social networks, had higher mortality rates over the period that was examined. So we think then that social support networks are an important preventative factor against all sorts of illness, including premature death. So, as I mentioned, social networks can be more than just your friends and your family. They are primarily about your friends and family. They're interactions between individuals and groups, but also about institutions. And when we talk about policy and the extent to which governments and organizations can enact practices and programs to help support social networks, the role of institutions becomes more predominant. How we analyze social networks is challenging. There isn't really an agreed-upon framework, but one of the ways we can do this is to look at the number of people in your life, how often you see them, the intensity of your interaction with them, how diverse the people in your lives are. Are they all the same gender? Are they all the same ethnicity, the same age? Do they offer different avenues of help, or are they all repeating the same sets of information at you? So these are all important factors in assessing the quality of the network of support that you receive. But again, how we analyze this can be quite complex. What is a social network or social support is also up for definition. But one definition is it's information. Social support is information that leads you, the subject, the individual, to believe that you are cared for, loved, and you have self-esteem. So yes, a lot of this is about building up the individual to make them more robust to the perturbations in their lives that may affect them deterministically and health-wise. Keep in mind that when we're talking about the determinants of health, it's not just one factor that influences whether or not someone is ill or not. It's a combination of interactive forces. So social networks don't act in isolation. Very often, they are either empowering or disempowering the role of another determinant of health, and vice versa. Maybe, for example, low income affects who you can socialize with and how many friends and how often you get to see them. At the same time, If you haven't got enough friends, that may affect your career growth and your income levels. All this stuff is closely intertwined. There is this thing called reciprocity. Reciprocity simply means that if I give you, you give me, and vice versa. This isn't a one-way street, and it's particularly important in a social network. We like to think about social networks and the value of social supports as they affect the health of an individual at the center of a network. In this case, you. You as an individual have your friends and your family and your community members, and we like to think about the value that that brings to you. But you are also part of that network, and you're bringing value to them. So there are implications for the interconnectivity and the two-way flow of support and information. There are 4 dimensions to social support: emotional, instrumental, informational, and appraisal. What does this mean? Well, emotional support, we sometimes call this non-tangible or intangible support, is the kind of thing that you probably thought about first when I first started talking about emotional support. You probably thought about, I just broke up with my girlfriend or boyfriend and I'm feeling sad and my friend's going to talk me through it. So that's the kinds of things people in your life will do to make you feel better. Or maybe, they notice you have a drinking problem and they'll sit you down and say, I think you've been drinking too much. That's emotional support. Or you're having a hard time with your exams and you're feeling stressed and someone will say, hey, let's go play some squash and burn off that negative energy that you have. That's emotional support. And I think we have an innate understanding of what that means. Instrumental support, on the other hand, is tangible, it's measurable, it's feelable, and it's the physical things that your social network brings you, like money. So if your spouse, for example, is the breadwinner in your family, then he or she allows you to buy things in your life. He or she allows you access to education and to products and other kinds of things. If you're a student and you still go home on the weekends to have your mother do your laundry, well, that's a tangible asset that your social support, in this case your mother, gives you. If you get to borrow your parents' car, that's a tangible asset that they bring you, that you would not have access to if you did not have that kind of network. Take a moment and think about the kinds of things that you have in your life, the measurable assets, not the emotional support, but the measurable things that you have in your life that are due exclusively to your social network. Are you borrowing someone's coat right now? Are you sleeping on someone's couch? Do your parents pay for your cell phone bill? Do you get an allowance still? I don't know. It could be any number of things. But all of those are direct products of the quality and extent of your social support network. And the quality of your life, and therefore your health, would not be as good if you didn't have those products and assets in your life. The informational dimension is the information that your network brings you. For example, let's say you are drinking too much, and your friend says, hey, I think you're drinking too much. That's emotional support, but also you should go see a counselor. That's information. Or, you know what, if you want to get your driver's license faster, you can go to this other town where there's a shorter lineup to be tested. That's information that has a measurable, quantifiable, direct impact on the quality of your life. You would not have that information had it not been for the quality and extent of your social network. Hopefully you start to see what I mean by this. The quality and the amount of people in your life have a direct and important and a rich effect on the quality of your life. And lastly, we have this appraisal dimension. So appraisal is the extent to which your network allows you to evaluate yourself. And this isn't some airy-fairy, hippy-dippy, new age thing about spiritual growth, even though that's important. This is about, do I have enough information from my network to allow me to recognize when things are not going well, even without their direct input? Maybe they tell me, hey, you had one too many drinks last night, or something like that. I keep using that example because that's a classic example. And you are now able to use that information to determine, what else is wrong with my life? What is something bothering me that I need to address? So these 4 dimensions aren't discrete necessarily. You start to see how they overlap. Because I use the drinking example a couple of times here, they're applicable to all 4 cases. But that's how we like to think about the role of social support networks as a therapeutic aspect of the holistic, healthy human animal. So, we believe that social networks can promote healthy behaviors. How? Well, if your friend wants to go for a run with you, you're more likely to go for a run. If you want to quit smoking and your peer group is supportive of that decision, you are profoundly more likely to quit smoking. Remember, the best way to predict how an individual behaves health-wise is to look at how their friends are behaving health-wise. There is no stronger risk factor. Well, okay, there are a few stronger risk factors. Genetics, may possibly. But the extent to which your social group does things is a very strong predictor of whether or not you do things. So if you want to change your behavior, I'm best served by targeting the behavior of your entire social group. The big ones are physical activity. You're far more likely to exercise if you socialize with people who exercise. You're far more likely to relax, not stress out over things like exams, if you're with a social group that relaxes and doesn't stress out over exams. Of course, social networks can promote psychological well-being as well. Obviously, if your friends are telling you all the time, hey, you're doing great, your self-esteem is fantastic, you should be proud of yourself, you're far more likely to have that sense of well-being. Obviously, parents have a profound effect when it comes to things like self-esteem and confidence. So a lot of this bleeds into early childhood experiences as well. Your experiences in public school around coping mechanisms for stress have an effect for the rest of your life. I see this as a professor. The young people in my undergraduate classes, I can tell if they've had good coping experiences in public school because they're the ones who are going to respond well when they get a bad mark, and the ones who didn't have a good coping experience in public school are the ones who are going to crumble if they get a bad mark. Resilience is a very important facet when it comes to the psychological characteristics of your social network. Are you able to develop a sense of personal resilience that allows you to withstand the onslaughts of adult life? Now, there is a theory that the extent to which we interact with our social network has a measurable physiological effect on our biological health. Look at this model. So here we have the social support that we get from our network. That changes our behavior. Like, maybe we smoke less. Maybe we go to the gym more. Maybe we eat better foods. As well, we have the affirming and coping psychological aspects that the social support gives us. Well, I feel really good about the fact that I'm exercising more. As a result, I have a lot less stress. I sleep better. I wake up far more enthusiastic and positive about my day. What does this lead to? Low blood pressure, less cortisol in my blood. My immune system is better, and that leads to measurable biological positive health outcomes. So there is a straight line, well, not exactly a straight line, a bent line between the quality of my social network and the measurable quality of my physical health. Here's an example that I stole from the University of Pennsylvania website. We have a 39-year-old graduate student. She is the mother of 2 children, and she feels overwhelmed, understandably, because she has been sadly diagnosed with breast cancer. So let's work through how her social network manifests in her life via those 4 dimensions. So we have our emotional, instrumental, informational, and appraisal dimensions of the social support network. And here are definitions again. Emotional is about are expressions of love and trust. Instrumental is about tangible physical assets that your network brings you, like money, like a car. Information is, again, actual information, advice, knowledge. And appraisal is, again, how we use our social network for self-examination. So for her emotional support, she has her close friends and family that she is able to talk her problems with, her stresses about her breast cancer, the fact that if she dies, her children are orphans. This is a very demanding situation, and in absence of a social network, her fears might turn inward and cause her a higher degree of stress and suffering. The instrumentality of her social network manifests this way. Well, her husband steps up, but he decides to work from home for 2 days a week so she can attend chemotherapy. In absence of a supportive partner, she would have the additional stress of having to find childcare while she seeks chemotherapy, or maybe have to forego that chemotherapy entirely, which happens more commonly than you think. Economic, personal, familial, childcare stresses often prevent people from seeking the care that they need to treat a profound illness. So in this case, her social network is her husband, and he provides a measurable physical asset, which is childcare. The informational dimension manifests this way. Well, her doctors give her facts and guidance about her treatment process and advice on how to best deal with the chemotherapy. Her mother also gives her advice because her mother went through the same process years ago. Now, in absence of that network, maybe she could find that information elsewhere if she were a capable knowledge explorer. But not many people are. Very few people actually know how to find medical information on their own. But she has a useful network that's very giving and has experience. She's lucky that her mother had a similar experience. Well, not lucky necessarily, but it's an asset in this case. So here we have a situation where the diversity of her network steps up. She has an older person in her life who's had this experience that is now able to contribute. The appraisal aspect. Well, she has a close friend, and her friend reminds her that she is strong and that she is resilient, and she has all these personal qualities that will allow her to persevere through this very trying time. In absence of this friend, maybe she would have more self-doubt. Now, obviously, in this case, there's some overlap between the emotional, the appraisal, and the informational components here. Like I said, these are not purely discrete boxes of things. It's a framework for understanding social support. Let's talk now about this thing called social capital. Like other kinds of capital, social capital can be accumulated and spent. Capital is an economics term, meaning a thing that has value that we can trade for other things that have value. So social support networks leverage social capital. And social capital is the power to affect social change. Where does that power come from? It comes from trust. It comes from people's trust in their institutions and in their groups and in their networks, and also the willingness they have to engage with those networks, and the assumption that other members of those networks have the same amount of willingness. The word trust keeps popping up when we talk about social capital, because that is the thing that we are spending and relying upon. If you think about political capital is a kind of social capital. So a politician may build trust with his constituency by having consistently delivered on his promises, to the point where suddenly he can spend that capital to ask his constituents to say, bear with me, I want to propose a controversial bill that maybe you don't agree with right now, but you trust me because in the past you've seen that I am reliable, and at the end of the day, I deliver for you. So he spends that political capital to get his way in the end. Social capital is kind of similar. You build trust with individuals and networks such that you can spend that capital when it becomes time to do so. Like, I trust my friends. There will come a time when I'm in crisis and I will need their help. And so they have learned to trust me as well, and they're more willing to give their help because we have that bond. So we define social capital as features of social organizations such as networks, norms, and social trusts that facilitate coordination and collaboration for mutual benefit. Again, it's the cooperation, trust, and confidence aspects that shine through. There are various kinds of social capital. We'll talk about three of them here. Bonding social capital is what we think about first. It's the nature of the trusting relationship you have with your close friends and family. Right? I assume you love your friends and your family. You trust them. You can probably place your lives in their hands. You have bonded to them. That is the beauty of the human social animal, is that we make such profound, meaningful connections with people. And if you haven't got that connection with a person, you are more vulnerable in the world. So the bonding social capital is paramount. The bridging social capital is the kinds of bonds we have with people who are less close to us, people we have less in common with, but we have overlapping interests with. For example, your coworkers, if you have a job, or your neighbors. You don't love your neighbor probably, but you live on the same street, so you have interests that overlap. You don't love your coworker, or the person in the cubicle next to you, but you have interests that overlap. That is maintaining the quality of your workplace. Your fellow students in class, maybe they're your friend, maybe you're not. I'm sure you don't think about them late at night, how much you love them, but you have a shared interest in the quality of your education, maintaining a safe and clean environment, and so forth. So, the extent to which you have relationships with those people and trust that they will deliver in the roles that they have is something useful. You can go to work every day and have reasonable faith that your coworkers will do their jobs, will not cause a ruckus in the office, will not pollute the environment, will not make you unsafe or stressful. It's not always true, but that's the kinds of things we have trust in. And lastly, linking social capital. So linking social capital is when people or organizations can exert influence outside of their networks. So, I'm trying to think of an example of this. At your university, you have health services. Those health services are not part of the teaching environment of the university. You pay your tuition to go to class and have access to a professor of varying quality, but that university has bridged and linked across institutions with a medical institution. So now, if you suddenly get ill, you don't have to go outside of the network of your university to seek medical care. You can do so right in the comfort of your own institution. That linkage has been made for you. That's a kind of social capital. How do we measure social capital? I mentioned the word trust a lot because it comes down to trust. It is the extent to which you trust members of your network. This isn't a universal. This isn't something that comes immediately. Trust is common but rare. There are many societies in which social capital has been degraded, where due to the stresses of military insecurity, economic insecurity, natural disasters, the social capital has been worn away. So, it's a valuable thing that you feel comfortable in the place that you live, that you can take the bus and go to school and not have to think about, to a large extent, your safety, whether or not the university will still be there when you get there, whether or not the electricity will work, whether or not the Wi-Fi will work, if your professor will show up, all of those things. So you have great trust that these institutions and individuals will do their part. Therefore, your social capital is strong. So there is a number of studies that attempt to measure the value of social capital, and here's a few examples here. There's one study that found that people in more disadvantaged groups were more likely to know and speak to their neighbors, but less likely to trust them. So, if you're poor or vulnerable, yeah, you might know more people for a lot of reasons, but you have less trust. That's poor social capital. It's not just the numbers of people in your network, it's the quality of the relationships in the network. They found that 60% of respondents in a particular survey felt well informed about local affairs. Why do we care about that? Well, the degree of engagement in your community, how much knowledge you have, is a measurement, a little bit, of trust. You trust your news. You trust the information being given to you by other members of your network and community. So these are measurements of social capital. A quarter of respondents in the study felt that they could personally influence decisions in their area. All right, this is interesting. So remember that reciprocity idea, that it's not just about you and what you get from the network, but what you give back to the network. So if you are confident that you can trust people in your network and that they can trust you, then that probably means that you feel confident enough that your word, your presence, your opinions have weight. If that's the case, that's a high degree of social capital. That you have earned sufficient trust that your will has some value in that network. Here's some more observations from studies. Men with low social capital, however that's measured, in this case the extent to which they trust their network, were nearly twice as likely to have a psychiatric disorder. So remember the egg and chicken thing. Correlation is not causation, all that other stuff. So it's possible that people with a psychiatric disorder are less inclined to make good social networks. It's also possible that people with good social networks are less inclined to be psychiatrically problematic. The prevalence of poor self-rated health was higher in neighborhoods with more family ties. Less integration into wider social society and lower levels of trust. So again, trust comes into play. Less trust means less health. Membership in voluntary groups and higher levels of social trust had a more equal income structure and lower total disease-specific mortality rates. Okay, so the more social trust you have, especially in voluntary groups. So voluntary groups, social groups, things that you join, are indications usually of trust, because why would you join them otherwise? Not always, but often. So again, trust associated with low mortality rates. So for fun, I would like you to try this quiz on this website, heretohelp.bc.ca. It's a quiz that measures the quality of your relationships. So it's like 15 questions you check off to the extent to which each of these characteristics applies to you. For example, I share the same approach to life that many of my friends do. Does that describe you, yes or no, across a Likert scale? And this will compute for you a score. 3 scores, actually. The first one tells you how supported you feel by your friends. The second tells you how supported you feel by your family. And the last one is how supported you feel in general. So it's very you-centric. I mentioned this reciprocity thing where the networks are not just about you getting stuff. It's you giving back stuff. But this test gives you a sense of how much you feel you're getting stuff from your network. And hopefully you've all got scores higher than 3. If you don't, you may want to reevaluate the qualities of your social network. The converse of social support is social exclusion. Exclusion is bad. We are, human beings, social beings. If you don't believe me, think about prison. Hopefully none of you have been to prison. But what's the worst punishment you get in a Western prison? It's not flogging, it's not starvation, it's not beatings. It's isolation. Being denied the social contact with your fellow human beings is one of the worst punishments. We shrivel and die, if not physically, then certainly mentally, without repeated, high-quality social contact with other human beings. So, social exclusion can occur in many subtle ways. It isn't just about being locked up in a hole and denied conversation. It's about being denied access to civil society and access to social constructs. There are people living and walking amongst us who are nonetheless isolated to some extent. So the first is denial of participation in civil affairs. What does that mean? Well, you can be excluded from civil affairs in a variety of ways. For example, can you vote? Well, now we have laws that allow any citizen to be able to vote, Not so long ago, women weren't allowed to vote. Certain ethnicities weren't allowed to vote. People in prison, I'm not so sure if they're allowed to vote. All right, so denial of the vote is a denial of participation in the political process. Someone who just moved to this country may not have their qualifications recognized by our society yet. That's a kind of exclusion. If your identity is tied up in being a doctor and suddenly you can't be a doctor, you're being excluded from a social stratum that you are familiar with. And of course we have those age-old problems like racism and sexism, which also prevent individuals from fully expressing social inclusion. Denial of social goods. What's a social good? Well, traditional social goods are things like clean air and clean water. But that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking more about the social goods, like literacy or access to services. What kind of services? Health services are obvious for a class on determinants of health, but also legal services. Do you know where to get a lawyer? Or can you afford a lawyer? Do you know where to get financial assistance? How to open an account? How to start investments? If no one has taught you how to do these things, if you don't have people in your life to tell you how to do these things, if you can't speak the local language and figure out how to do these things, you're excluded from the services in your society that allow you to access these critically important institutions of modern life. So language barriers are one of the biggest reasons for social exclusion. Or maybe you can't access education opportunities because of a variety of other factors. One of the biggest challenges that immigrants in this country have is ignorance of what to do and how to do them. How do you go about getting a home? How do you go about getting a bank account? How do you go about registering your child in school? It's not obvious. You've got to dig around to find this information. And in absence of the social networks that allow you to do so, you are excluded from those institutions and therefore excluded from even further social networking. Exclusion from social production. What is social production? Well, it's the act of creating culture. Who creates culture? Artists? Participants? If you go to a show, you are participating in social creation. If you speak to someone about your ideas, you are participating in social production. Think about how much it costs to send your child to play hockey if you've got kids. If you haven't got kids, you probably are a kid and you play hockey. It costs a lot of money. Poor people cannot afford to send their children to such experiences. Low-income people cannot afford to send their children to learn about the environment or to learn to play the piano or things like that. Not without great sacrifice. So suddenly we see the interaction here between the other determinants of health, like income, like education, like gender, like race, and social networks. So in absence of the ability to access these things, like playing hockey, like going to music class, you have a different stratum of individual in society who cannot participate in those cultural, social activities. They're excluded. And that exclusion process, if it starts early enough, will exacerbate. Think about the divides in society, the haves and the have-nots. If you think about the rich people living in this city, who are they? Just close your eyes and think about them. They're probably white. They're probably Anglophone. They probably have deep multi-generational ties to this country. They probably have certain childhood experiences in your mind. They probably played the piano, went to music class. They probably went to hockey class. They probably had all these experiences that the people that you imagine who aren't wealthy didn't have. And think about how that probably started. Economic exclusion. What does that mean? Well, economic exclusion is when you're excluded from the economy, when you're excluded from economic activity. Who is excluded from economic activity? Well, people who struggle to get jobs. So that's often the first level of social exclusion, is exclusion from economic activity. People who are economically vulnerable include new immigrants who don't know the system well enough yet to get a job. Aboriginals are constantly being excluded. And of course, the classic sets of individuals who are employment challenged, women, disabled people, certain minorities, and so forth. So we've talked about social capital, social exclusion. Now let's talk about the social safety net, which is an attempt by society, often formally by government, to create a process by which those who are excluded can nonetheless be saved or prevented from falling all the way. So a social safety net is, and this is the Wikipedia definition, a collection of services provided by the state, but not always, it could be other institutions, including things like unemployment insurance or welfare, health care, which we'll talk about a little bit, homeless shelters, and sometimes we'd include things like the fire department or public transportation, or even the fact we have public schools. These are social safety nets to some extent. Classically, a social safety net is a thing produced by society that prevents people from falling all the way to the bottom if they slip. If you lose your job, what prevents you from being homeless? Well, unemployment insurance, right? If you lose your car, what allows you to get to work so you don't lose your job? Well, the bus does, and the bus is subsidized by the city, so it doesn't cost as much as actually buying a bus. Those kinds of things. So in absence of a social safety net, people live under the very real threat of personal disaster, usually financial disaster, but financial disaster leads to physical disaster. This model shows us the way in which social safety nets arise, emerge from other kinds of public policy. They aren't strictly an economic thing, they aren't strictly a social thing, they're a combination of a variety of other kinds of government policies. So economic policies would be things like taxes and how we regulate trade. Social policies would be things like our education system, our labor laws, our criminal justice system, etc. Other public policies would include things like how we protect our environment, how we deal with immigration, and so forth. The social safety net takes into consideration all of these policies and creates a process or a set of policies and programs and initiatives that accounts for individuals who might be poorly served by these policies. So here's a policy framework to consider when thinking about how governments would create a social safety net. So first we have the influencing factors, like history. Does society have a history of having people fail? A history of having a large number of people have medical bankruptcies or losing their job and therefore living on the street and dying prematurely? If that's the case, then when we've established that there is a social need here. What are the policy goals when creating a social safety net? Well, we want to create basic financial security. Maybe we want to protect certain kinds of people, like women, disabled, aboriginals, maybe. On top of that, we have the social values of your society, which are going to differ from society to society. For example, the Americans really value individualism and freedom. Why does that matter? Well, if you're a highly individualistic society, you may not want to help people who made questionable decisions about their work life and lost their job. On the other hand, maybe you want to create a society that is forgiving to people who have personal bankruptcies because they took business risks, and that aligns well to your personal libertarian set of values. Maybe you value the work ethic above all else and fairness. Maybe you don't. So these two sets of goals have to be considered when framing your social safety net. So the philosophy behind a social safety net matters. Some people believe the benefit should be a right. The access to unemployment insurance should be a right. The access to health insurance should be a right. Other people believe it's a privilege that you have to earn. Who's right? That depends on your perspective. That depends on, again, the values of your society. So when governments make these social safety nets, Not everyone is going to have the same thinking around it. Okay? And how are you going to pay for this? How are you going to mechanize or instrumentalize the social safety net? Maybe it'll be paid for by taxes, or maybe it'll be a tax break. Instead of actually giving someone unemployment insurance, we say, hey, you don't pay taxes for a year. Right? So how the policy enacts is also important. The reason I show this is to remind you of two things. One is that a social safety net isn't guaranteed in every human society, and not everyone values it the same way. It arises from a political mentality and perspective. And the second is that not every social safety net manifests and looks exactly the same. Some are simple things like tax breaks, others are programs, others are actual buildings. So in Victorian England, we had this thing called the poorhouse, which was a horrible, horrible place. But it was an example of a social safety net. The poorhouse, or the workhouse rather, was the last place you went if you were really, really poor. And the truly poor tried their hardest to avoid the workhouse. So the workhouse was a place you went when you lost all hope. The men were separated from the women, the boys separated from the girls. You were given a job to do. You did that job and nothing else. You were given basic rations, and there was no room for fun or education or social advancement of any kind. And if you deviated from any of the rules, for example, if the men were caught speaking to the women, there was severe punishment, sometimes eviction. So that's a kind of brutal form of social safety net. The intent was somewhat honorable. They wanted to make sure these people did not starve to death, but the way it was enacted was quite brutal and unpleasant. So we don't want to have the workhouse scenario as a social safety net. We'd like to have other kinds of softer mechanisms, like a guaranteed income, like health insurance, and so forth, with the goal being to put people back on their feet, rather than simply to sustain their lives. This shows us a distribution worldwide of the extent to which governments spend on social programs. Now, the gray areas aren't covered, not because there are no social spending, but because we don't have data in this particular graph from those areas. This is just for OECD countries. OECD stands for the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. It is essentially the rich countries of the world. So the darker the color, the more a proportion of national wealth is spent on social programs. Interestingly, the USA is darker than Canada. This chart shows us the breakdown of the socialist programs that are being spent geographically. So the blue areas are for old age spending, and the light blue areas for health. Interestingly, the rich countries, the OECD countries, spend less on old age programs than does Brazil. What can we take away from this? Not a whole lot, but this may be an indication of a cultural value. If your culture has a certain value placed on the plight of the elderly, that's where you'll spend your money. If your culture has value placed on the plight of the sick and injured, that's where you'll spend your money, and so forth. Right? So all these are indications of political value and social value. Now this statistic should be sobering. This is the number of people who go bankrupt every year because of medical bills. This is data from the USA, I think last year. So in all these countries, nobody went bankrupt for medical reasons. In the USA, more than 500,000 people did. Medical bankruptcy is the single greatest source of financial ruin in the USA, which is why it was so important that they developed a healthcare strategy, which is why President Obama created so-called Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, to help assuage this big problem. What do all these countries, Britain, France, Japan, Germany, Canada, all have in common? We all have socialized medical care. We all have a social safety net explicitly developed around health care. The USA didn't until Obamacare, and may not have it for much longer, depending upon what the new administration does. So this chart shows us, again, the leading causes of personal bankruptcy in the USA, if you believe this data. I took this from a law firm's website. The numbers may not be correct, but the ranking certainly is. So it's not job loss that's the biggest cause of bankruptcy. It's not divorce, despite what some people might tell you. It's, again, medical expenses. What kind of medical expenses? Usually surgeries or cancers. So heart surgery is a very common one. If you have a heart attack in your 50s and you're a hard-working, working-class individual with no health care, that will cost you everything. You have to sell your house, sell your car, suddenly your spouse is in debt as well, and you will never get out. It's very rare to recover from these bankruptcies. For the rest of your life, you are financially ruined. Now, if you had a social safety net, a process by which this was not a life sentence of poverty, then you'd be in better standing. So these are the types of debt collected by the USA 3 years ago. Not surprisingly, for most of you listening, student debt is one of the biggest sources of personal debt. Credit card debt is up there, certainly. Your mortgage actually is not the biggest source of debt. However, healthcare is the single biggest source of personal debt in the USA. So people go into debt to pay for their drugs, their surgeries, their life-saving treatments. You could argue that maybe you can forego an education. Maybe you don't need all the stuff you bought at Nordstrom's. Maybe you can get away with not buying a house you can rent. Maybe you don't need a cell phone, but you definitely need your medicine to live. And this is a problem. So we have this thing then called Medicare. Medicare is the word we use for a publicly funded health care system. And this is a kind of social safety net. In Canada, the father of Medicare is this guy, Tommy Douglas. Maybe you've heard of him. He was the Premier of Saskatchewan from the 40s to the 60s. He used to be the leader of the federal NDP. And he gave us the kind of Medicare that we currently use, the different kinds of Medicare. He was also voted the greatest Canadian of all time in a contest that CBC had a few years ago. And he's also the grandfather of Kiefer Sutherland. If you want to win a pub trivia night thing one day, you can use that question. So, born out of Tommy Douglas's vision of Medicare is the Canada Health Act. And the Canada Health Act just tells us how we pay for health care. It doesn't tell the provinces who delivers health care or how to organize it. It's just how to pay for it. We have in Canada something called a single-payer system. A single-payer system is one in which one body or institution does all the payment. In this case, the single-payer is the government. The government pays the doctors, pays the hospitals. The insurance companies don't do it. The government does it. So the Canada Health Act essentially says that the provinces are responsible for giving you health care. The federal government, Health Canada, is responsible for setting the policies, collecting the data, managing the infrastructure, and also for giving service to specific groups like Aboriginals, military, diplomats, people like that. It's an expensive system. Social safety networks are not cheap, especially healthcare ones. And where does this money go? Canada spends under $200 billion a year on healthcare for its 35 million residents. So most of that money goes towards paying for hospitals, pay of doctors, drugs that are administered in the hospitals, the actual physical plant, the actual buildings of the hospitals, and things like transportation and administration. I want to finish off with this thought. Social networks are also physical networks. What do I mean by that? Think about older societies like in India or China and how they view the value of family members. Exactly the same way we view them. Right? They're loved ones to be cherished, people with information, people who can give you assets and so forth. But also, if you are an old person in a society with no pensions, with no elder care institutions, then your health insurance is your children and grandchildren. If you don't have children and grandchildren, you have no care in your old age. So there is an impetus there to create your own social networks. This is not a new thing. The value of social networks has been with us since the human animal emerged onto the savannas. Who takes care of the elderly? The young do. Therefore, family networks are predominantly important in such cultures. So, the economic value of children is high, the social value of children is high, and the social value of everybody in your network is high if the trust levels are also high. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.